Happy to be part of this today. Particularly this year, I am not able to be in physical presence in ARA. And then when Dr. Wang invited me, I felt so happy that at least I could contribute in this way and be part of ARA SIG. Um, I really value the SIG and I really admire efforts of Dr. Wang. He is a great leader, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share some of these works. And those of you who are joining, thank you very much for your time and your interest and taking the time to join this webinar session. Today, will be talking about school climate in low and middle income countries. And I've titled it as Developments, Challenges, and Opportunities. And I wanted to make it fairly more discussion focused rather than too much of a lecture. So I'll try to limit my talk to about 15, 20 minutes and then maybe 20 minutes, and then we will see what discussions we have. I look forward to learning from you. There is so much to learn in this field, and looking for a very engaging discussion. So, is it okay if I start sharing my screen, Dr. Wang?
Yes, please.
Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes,
Okay.
showing now.
Okay, great. So, let me get started. I will do a little bit of a background just to set the stage, and probably all of you know what school climate is. Um, and just to make it a little personal, as Dr. Huang was mentioning, my actual field of expertise is economics of education. That's where I did my PhD. But after my doctoral studies, I was fortunate to be part of National School Climate Center as a research director, where I was brought in to evaluate and do instrument design of many school climate and social emotional learning related projects. And that's how I got introduced to this amazing field. And this field is very close to my heart because I firmly believe that school climate, social emotional learning is what we need to focus in the coming years for our children, for our society, and for the field as such. So many of you know that there are many different definitions of school climate, but in short, we can say as character and quality of school life. We use different terms, uh, environment, culture, atmosphere. If you look at the literature, you'll see a lot of terms being used. But more and more now, we are getting more consensus on what it means. But that is one of the challenge of the field. And there are many camps also. Dr. Huang referred to John earlier, and he sends his regards, but he won't be able to join today. He got pulled into an important meeting. But we see that there are many camps, overlapping camps like school culture, pro-social education, social, emotional, and civic learning, character education, mental health, and so forth. Some of these are very overlapping, and some of them are moderately overlapping. So I just also wanted to share that. Why is this field important? This field is extremely important for me, at least, and there is a growing interest in this field from around the world. Researchers, probably Dr. Wang also can attest to this, are reaching out for many questions, for assessment tools and whatnot. So there is so much of growth on this field, and people are realizing the value, particularly in the last 2 decades. So I just wanted to put this one: a sustainable, positive school climate fosters youth development and learning necessary for a productive, contributing, and satisfying life in a democratic society. And although it is sourced from the Council 2015, but if you look at the literature, you will see this being reflected in many, many studies. I will skip this part. And I also want to quickly touch on the dimension of school climate. There's some debate in the school climate world on what dimensions constitute school climate. But from the research study that Dr. Huang was mentioning earlier, 2013, we did a very comprehensive review with Fordham University and researchers at National School Climate Center. And we identified from the literature 5 major dimensions. The first one is safety, and it is very overarching safety, including both physical and social emotional safety. Second, the whole world of teaching and learning, the support, the feedback, the relationship between teaching and teachers and students. And then you can see the third one is relationship, which is again the adult to adult relationship, student to each student relationship, and then adult to students relationship. The fourth one is institutional environment, which comprise mainly the belongingness and also the physical surroundings of the schools, the layout and everything. And finally, there is quite a bit of studies on the overall process of school climate. How does the overall school climate improvement process look like? So we've identified these 5, but if you were to see an assessment of school climate, mostly you will see on the first 4. And you will not be surprised that there is a high degree of overlap between these 5 dimensions. But if you look at the federal Department of Education's Safe and Healthy Students, they usually come to 3 dimensions: safety, engagement, and environment. The reason I'm showing you different dimensions is because they sound slightly different in terms of the words, but more or less they're tapping the similar construct. Yeah. And so let me jump into low and middle income countries. What my work and what I have learned by research, by listening to scholars and being in the field is that the research shows that we have almost 100 years history in school climate. People have been starting to write about school climate about 100 years ago. I am from low and middle income countries. So LMIC stands for low and middle income countries. I'm from Nepal originally, and we are very behind in social emotional learning and school climate and mental health. So that is another reason why I'm very interested in this topic. And I teach a course called Global Perspective of School Climate at University of Pennsylvania, and students are very attracted to that course over the years, the trend. So that is my personal motivation. But as we know, there are many factors that shape school climate in low and middle income countries. Most of these factors are very similar to high income countries, but there are some very exclusive factors that are exclusive to low and middle income countries. And understanding and improving school climate is an improvement part of the educational access and quality and in low and middle income countries. And good news is that even in low and middle income countries, in the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen positive developments. There have been some good papers, good studies that have taken interest in low and middle countries. For example, this paper, Larson et al. 2020, had a very nice literature review on about school climate and the measurement practices in low and middle income countries. And we also took motivation from this study, but it focused mostly on, some of these outcomes related matters. And we thought we can look more into that. And in summary, it found that a positive school climate was beneficial for student outcomes. But many of you here might be from low and middle income countries or might have worked in low and middle income countries. In the last few years, I've been talking with so many people, particularly in South Asia and in Africa, and school climate is still quite rare in some of the important discussions relating to educational planning and policy. So how does in quick summary, how does formal education in low and middle income countries look like? I think many of you, all of you perhaps are familiar with some of these, but very quickly, these countries grapple with the constraint on the resources, for example, inadequate funding, infrastructure, learning materials, teacher salaries, and then, as I said, infrastructure like overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and so forth. The second is they lack basic facilities, even like toilets and water and some other um, safe places for students to learn. Some of you might have seen this classical picture of students learning under a tree, in Africa and some Asian countries. The third one is school-based violence, gender inequality, and gender-based violence are quite prevalent in many of these places, which is particularly affected with conflict. And there is lack of training also and support, and that coupled with poor administration practices, really affect the teacher morale. And there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of teacher retention, teacher morale, and teacher quality. So there are many. I can go on and on. As you can see, you can make a conference out of this, but just wanted to give a quick snapshot on this. So when we looked up, there are many constructs or frameworks of school climate, around the world now. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is just a few examples. For example, AIR has conditions for learning. UNICEF has child-friendly school framework that was started as early as 1999. Nowadays, PISA also has some questions relating to social emotional learning and school climate. So researchers can actually utilize some of those questions if they are interested to learn more about school climate. I have some colleagues at Columbia and others. They're starting to utilize some of these assessments and data from PISA and OECD. And as I already mentioned about the 5 dimensions that our team identified in 2013, and we published in a paper. And there are many other dimensions. So as I think I already talked about this motivation about learning school climate and focusing in low and middle income countries. So this is just a repetition. I'm going to skip this. Now, I'll talk about the method. I'm going to share in today's talk 2 methods. One is this systematic literature review that we conducted 2 years ago. And then last year, I visited some South Asian countries and a country in Africa, Mozambique. And I conducted some interviews with the researchers and people about school climate in low and middle income countries. So I'm going to share from these 2 places very quickly. So first one is the literature review. We had to set up our inclusion and exclusion criteria on that because it would be too much of an undertaking if we opened up everything. I don't want to spend too much time in it. If you're interested, you can go into the paper. Probably Dr. Huang can share the paper. I can share the paper. But we wanted to focus on the recent articles published in 2000 until 2000 recently. We wanted to look into formal K-12 schools. And we also wanted to look into only empirical studies. We did not include in this study online kind of education or expensive private school settings, education in emergency context, and so forth, just to keep the scope of the paper under limit and sharp. So our search process included looking into ERIC databases and a few other databases. We had a research team of 6 members, and that's why there is a long list of authors in this paper because we wanted everybody to be part of it. We used some Boolean operators and all of that to search the article. All of that is documented in the paper. But all in all, we had 4,000 plus initial articles collected in the pool. Only 172 met initial inclusion criteria, and those were included in summarizing what we do, what we find in this paper. So these are the main results that came up from these 172 articles. So surprisingly, we found that very few articles related to low-income countries. Remember that this was low and middle-income countries. And if you look at the UN or World Bank definition of middle-income countries, that can be further categorized into lower middle income and upper middle income countries. So it was a surprise, at the same time, not a surprise, that only 8.2% of these articles were from low income countries. That already is a big finding, shows that, not many studies are happening data from low income countries. So vast majority of them were from lower middle income countries, 91% of them. And majority of art publications were interestingly from 2016 onwards, although remember that we included all articles from 2000 onwards. So it was interesting that looks like the field was taking more interest, particularly in terms of a publication from 2016 onwards. And another interesting finding was that most of these papers, most of these articles were on secondary education, almost 70%, and less on primary education. And finally, the reason that I was sharing about the domains of school climate earlier, we tried to map out, what kind of domains these articles published in low and middle income countries constitute. And we found that they were fairly good representation of these domains across existing frameworks. So just to give you a little inside view of that domains, we found that 21% of the articles tapped directly into safety. The majority of the articles were relating to relationships. About 35% on teaching and learning and 35% on institutional environment. Remember that there is a good degree of overlap between these domains, and relationship is one of those domains which has a very high degree of overlap with the remaining other three dimensions. So this was interesting to see that the most of the articles were from relating to relationships. So now I also wanted to talk about, share a little bit from the interviews that I conducted in some South Asian countries in Africa last summer. I conducted some interviews in Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh in South Asia, and then Mozambique in Africa. So we found out, there are a lot of interesting findings, but I wanted to summarize mostly in three strands. One is a lot of people said that school climate, particularly social emotional health, social emotional learning or mental health related, are still a taboo topic in some of these low income countries. People do not like to talk too much about this still, so we are quite behind. So there is a sense that these researchers, educators said that we need more awareness about these topics in low income countries. That was quite clear. Second, what we found was most people, to the question, like why, are you engaged in social, emotional, or school climate efforts? And mostly they would say no. And then upon asking why, they would say that prioritization is another key reason. Prioritization in a sense that, remember earlier I was showing that slide on some of the challenges in low income countries. And the basic needs are already a big problem in low-income countries, like the infrastructure itself, the teacher quality, the teacher retention, and nowadays, even climatic hazards are creating havoc. And that is another topic that I've been involved in the last 5, 7 years, and we are investigating that. But but most of the people said that we we acknowledge that school climate is important. We we agree that social emotional learning and mental health are important, but they don't take the front seat. They don't take the first priority, and that's what they were saying. That I think that is another reason. And then third, most of the participants said that they really lack the resources to undertake any school climate and social emotional learning related efforts or projects. There are no guidelines for teachers or leaders if they wanted to embark in a social emotional learning related effort, or they wanted to improve the school climate. They don't know where to start from. They don't have a guidelines. They don't have any materials. There are some private organizations here and there in some of these countries, but very lack of resources. Second was lack of assessment tools. In high-income countries, there are many assessment tools. Some of them are, with fees. Some of them are publicly available. And some of the researchers and educators from low and middle-income countries have been reaching out to these institutions from high-income countries if they could utilize these assessment tools. For example, I get so many requests, but they are not fully contextual. Sometimes there are some elements in low and middle income countries that are very specific to those places, and the assessment tools designed catering to students here in high income countries do not totally tap all the needs of the low income countries. So there is a lot of room for improvements here, or room to work in terms of designing relevant, meaningful assessment tools for low and middle income countries. And then finally, even in high income countries, there is so much of confusion about school climate improvement process. I mean, they are, people, we talk about as a cycle, it's an iterative cycle where you start talking about the needs and preparation and planning, then you measure the school climate, and then you come up with the action plan, and then you implement the action plan, and then you reevaluate again. So even high income countries, they tend to stop in many schools, and system tend to stop after the assessment. There's not much work being done after action planning and implementation of school climate. So in low and middle income countries, we hardly, in my interviews, in my talking with these educators and researchers, I hardly heard any system, any schools embarking on a full school climate improvement process. So that is another area that has a lot of scope of work in low and middle income countries. So to summarize, I think particularly from our literature review, we found out that low and middle income countries have very unique contextual and cultural elements. And as I said earlier, new assessment tools that can incorporate those would be very helpful to the field. And there are many other things like domestic violence, religious and political conflicts, and natural disasters due to rapid change. And of course, they are relevant to everywhere, but they seem to be low and middle income countries seem to be more affected by them. And, catering to that would also be helpful in terms of policy design, in terms of research, in terms of practice. And even like if there were constructs and assessments that were designed on low and middle income countries, even high income countries could learn from those constructs. It should not be the only that, that we low income countries are always learning from high income countries. If we were to design some good assessment tools or constructs from low-income countries. It could be the otherwise also. And as I shared earlier, it was interesting to see that not much has been done in primary schools in low and middle income countries. Most of the studies, they seem to study only secondary school. So it would be nice to actually start learning about what is happening in primary schools, particularly in terms of school climate and low middle income countries. And I think many agree on that we are quite behind in terms of investigating studies that look into the causal relationships between some of these factors and student development, student learning, for various reasons. One reason is that it is very sophisticated, very complicated topic. It could lead to a lot of um, endogeneity issues and a lot of other estimation related issues. That is one. And second, I think lack of expertise and interest also. So more studies that look into value added, that utilize longitudinal study, that look into causal inference rather than just correlational studies, I think would benefit particularly the overall field, and then of course the low and middle income country settings. So here are a couple of recommendations from our studies that I think we need to invest more in data collection and databases of school climate, all levels of schooling. There is a lot of, and these apply not only to low and middle income countries, but high income countries also. There's so much of gap between research, policy, and practice. Of course, we'll see this gap in other fields also, but when it comes to school climate and social emotional learning, the gap is actually even bigger. That's what we found out. Many studies will actually attest to that. And I already talked about that. And then I think I wanted to revisit the ones that I shared earlier. There needs to be awareness. We need to develop more resources, and we need to have more teacher training and prioritize school climate and social emotional learning. So with that, I would like to bring close to my talk, and then if there are any comments or questions, I will take that and I'll stop the share. Thank you so much.